Welcome are we on session 4, I guess, 4 of 5 of Foundations of Religious Liberalism, which I've been so honored to offer to you, and thank you all for being a part of it along the way. We got 2 more weeks to go, and we've had kind of an overview the first week. We talked about authority and tradition. Last week we looked at some prophets of religious liberalism, Emerson, Channing, and Theodore Parker. Talked a little bit about Christology. And this week we're on to the social gospel as an expression of religious liberalism, and we'll talk some about the whole notion of progress as it fits into that. And then next week we'll kind of tie all the loose ends up, and it's a session I'm calling Failures and Futures, where we'll be as brutally critical as we're moved to be, and talk about some of the broad critiques, but also look at some complementary or even bolder forms of theology that maybe have a relationship to liberal religion as well. So thanks for being here for the social gospel. And I actually thought I would share some opening words tonight. This may be a somewhat surprising reading from a universalist who, as I described earlier, does not believe in the notion of certainly not eternal damnation. I haven't ruled out the possibility that people might need to have a little bit of the sin cooked out of them, but it would be a temporary operation. I can claim no authority as to what occurs afterward. But some folks who've claimed authority wrote and said these words. It's from Matthew 25, different Matthew. Starting in 31, a section usually called the sheep and the goats, relevant for our purposes tonight. When the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the angels with him, he will sit on his glorious throne. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate the people from one another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He will put the sheep on his right and the goats on his left. Then the king will say to those on his right, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father, take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me." Then the righteous will answer him, "Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and go to visit you?" And the king will reply, "Truly, I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me." We'll leave it there. The goats, of course, say, "When did we not do that?" And he says, "Truly, I tell you, whatever you did not do for one of the least of these, you did not do for me." And in this translation, it says, "Then they will go away to eternal punishment, but the righteous to eternal life." One of the passages that does indicate some state of eternal punishment. But the point, of course, is, as you did to the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. And really such an important and beautiful passage. And we're going to be talking about folks who took that passage and some others, such as Feed My Sheep, very, very seriously today. In a very real world kind of way. And just to get us anchored in the real world and make sure that we ourselves don't float off into the stratosphere, let's get our brains warmed up and our tongues moving. I'm going to break you out into little one-on-one groups. And here it is. I've given you $50 million and made you the czar of addressing the homeless problem in Portland. What would you do first? What ideas do you have? How might you improve the lot of people who right now, tonight, are living in a tent and getting rained on? I'm sure you think about it if you drive around town as I do. So let me just make some quick breakout rooms, and this will keep us from getting too heady. There might be a group that has 3 folks in it. All you must do is accept this invitation. I'll bring you back in 8 minutes or so. All right. Can't hear you, bud.
What would you do?
I would purchase whatever kind of residential facility is sitting out there empty, whether it's a hotel or something that could be converted, a school because it already has kitchens, an unused hospital, hotels that have been broken down, and aggressively tackle a housing first model. But the main thing would be to hire sufficient people to, on a case-by-case basis, actually provide folks with the care that they need. And based on some of the people I walk by, that might be like a 4-to-1 grown-up to street person ratio. But whatever it would take to keep the person clean, dry, and fed. I think, any kind of program of putting at least some folks to work, in the simplest sorts of ways. Santa Rosa had a downtown ambassador program that they started over the last few years. And, sketchy people would be dressed in a blue polo shirt and they'd walk around picking up garbage and smiling and stuff like that. And it at least helped make a person feel like a contributing member. And in some of these cases, I don't know how I would get the laws passed or whatever, but some people need to be re-institutionalized.
We only got up.
Okay,
we only figured out 30 million so far. We've got another 20 million to figure out.
That'd be an enormous amount for a small town like ours.
One wonders if it would be enough.
I don't think it would be.
I don't know about Matt and I enjoyed our conversation over here, and once you start getting real about actual rooms with actual ceilings and the necessary number of staff to take care of people who are very ill and so forth, that stuff, it adds right up. Any brilliant ideas or surprises or things that just hurt to talk about? Or I conduct this exercise because I drive home frequently right past a major encampment every single day. I'm sure many of you do. And so I am one of those who has not done for the least of them day after day after day after day, depending on how you define that. And partly it's because it's so hard to quite know what to do. Anything to share that was really striking, or somebody have a brilliant idea that you want to make sure enters the collective consciousness? Bill.
I want Michael to, I didn't write it down. I want him to quote correctly something he did earlier today about responsibility. Mike, can you do that?
Yeah, this was a talk I listened to before dinner about Abraham J. Heschel, the Jewish theologian. And he was quite a social activist. I guess I learned today, but the line that Bill's referring to was few are guilty, but all are responsible. And so if you apply that to the homeless situation, it seems sticks with us.
Right. And I might even ask, how does that apply to street folks themselves? Who are so frequently treated as guilty of some set of bad decisions, right? That that's one way we make sense of it in our heads, is like, well, they got hooked on meth, so, somehow I guess they're getting what they deserve. Something.
I think it was Barb who basically talked about what I would think of as triage, is trying to figure out who exactly the people are. Some agencies must know who most of them are, what their needs are, and then tried to, my example was $1 million would buy 10 professionals, like it would buy 10 teachers, for example. So that would give you, what's 50 million times 10? 500? No.
Well, you're saying 10 teachers at $1 million.
Yeah, 10 teachers at $1 million times 50.
Right. So that'd be 500 teachers.
500 teachers, you could say 500 professionals. You could immerse more of those teams into this, those model teams into the system. I think I'm just appalled that there are not restrooms for people, or
There are
there's so many things that there aren't. What did you say?
I'm sorry, in some encampments, they do have porta potties set up.
Right.
So
Right.
it's good. And some of these, they have porta potties and a shower arrangements in some of these tiny home encampments. I think those are an excellent first start. But one of the things that I think is, because we need something immediately, like tonight for these people, is 50 million. I wanted to put $50 million towards putting these folks in hotels.
Mm.
Short term, but they're cold and wet now.
Right. And even in that context, one thing I have thought in that, I'm a housing first guy all the way, and many people just don't even know how to live even vaguely responsibly in a building any longer. They don't know how to use appliances or cook, honestly. And so you also have to have the requisite people power. So you get those hotel rooms, but some folks who I've encountered on the street, I would say, need like 4 full-time humans working on just them. If what you're talking about is getting, showers and food and so on. And boy, that adds up in a hurry. You're super generous, Barbara. The actual, social worker pay rate's more like $25,000 a year, so we can hire a lot more people. Instead of your generous $100,000.
I'm not thinking that would include their benefits and their vacation. 10 years ago, a teacher plus benefits in the school system I worked in was average like $76,000. So, but I do think that what I know about original group homes, like hotels, you have to have teams of people to have to be planned to go in ahead of time to help them with all of the things that you talked about.
Yeah.
So, and there was a program like that, gosh, when Obama was president, under his Medicare Act, that Central City Concern talked about how they were able to help people, but there were several professionals involved.
Jim, a comment?
Also, once you have people in something like that, then the social workers don't waste time trying to track these people down. They know where they are, or they know somebody who knows where they are. And it becomes much easier to get them in some kind of a treatment plan with follow-up. But until you have them in a room where you can go back to when you'll be there, or somebody will know where they went, it becomes much harder or much more wasteful to get anything done.
Right.
They found they actually saved a lot of money once they had people. There was Utah had something going where they had the Mormon church involved, in the state, in the city, and they got some kind of a grant from the national government. And that was the big thing that they said was, once you have people located and you know what they are, you save a ton of money without spinning your wheels, being able to contact these people and get them into somebody where you can have follow-ups.
Right. Yeah. And then just one final complexity to add to the mix is, Matt and I wondered, so would you still let people who are addicted to drugs have drugs? Because actually, if you're a hardcore heroin addict, you might choose to stay on the streets where you could get heroin rather than to live in a little motel, even though it's dry and you're going to get fed if you can't have your drug. And so that opens up a whole nother moral can of worms as well. And the point ultimately to get us into the social gospel is, nothing is easy. Nothing is easy. Even the most visible, painful, prominent sort of social problem that you drive by every single day, you give yourself $50 million to solve the puzzle, and you realize oh my God, there's 10 times more things than I thought about, and we're going to run out of money in 2 years. And so we need to be somewhat humble, I guess, in the face of the woes of the world. Okay, thanks for that. I hope some of these ideas are eventually adopted here. All right, so the social gospel. I don't know if anyone poked around on the Wikipedia article or elsewhere, but if you did, you would have seen that this is a movement within Christianity that is associated with religious liberalism in some key ways, but in others actually can expand beyond it. There are and have always been people who are interested in the social gospel who have a full-on evangelical or even kind of literalist or fundamentalist view of the Bible or Christology or whatever, but they have an understanding of that leads them into direct social action. And the name itself kind of speaks to what we're talking about here, that the gospel, the good news, salvation, the healing of the world, what it means to live out that teaching from Matthew, and the example of Christ is to try and make a concrete difference in the real world for real people. And in many cases, regardless of whether or not they have themselves, followed the Christian path at all, but that the purest expression or the most essential expression of Christianity is making a difference in the world. And it emerges in the late 1800s, kind of in that period after the Civil War, a little later on, as the industrialization of the nation really begins to take off, and some of the most exploitive practices against workers, including children, are evidenced. You'll often see a phrase in a social gospel article saying something that it's like in response to the excesses of the Gilded Age. And if you remember the Gilded Age, which has not yet ended, if by it we mean a small group of people who have fantastic, shameless, and in-your-face amounts of wealth and money and power, while others labor for and with nothing. And interestingly, so on the one hand, some of this is just like you see child labor, you see 16-hour workdays, you see people living in filthy tenements, and your heart breaks, as ours does when we drive by the highway, and you think we have to do something about that. So there's a very sort of pure-hearted origin for some of the major figures. And then interestingly enough, a component, this is less familiar to me until I did more reading this last week. There were a certain number of people, particularly those we would call evangelical progressives now, maybe, or back then, who believed that Jesus would not come again until people had made a kingdom worthy of his presence and his leadership. That in the Gospels and the teachings, what that world was supposed to look like, where everybody had food and everybody had shelter and everybody had clothes, minimum from our reading, that until humans showed that they were worthy of the kingdom of God by doing what was within their power to construct, that frankly explained why the second coming had not occurred in all those hundreds and hundreds of years. He was like, I told you what to do, and nobody's done it yet. So partly prompted by that, and partly prompted just by conscience. Notable figures such as, most prominently, Walter Rauschenbusch, and slightly before him, Washington Gladden, if you came across those names, are the most frequently invoked, began to write books and pamphlets and preach sermons that, other than their biblical inspiration or the references of scripture passages and so forth, you might very well take to be political or economic analysis or tracts or promotional materials for whatever was passing for the socialist or even communist parties at certain times, though obviously with a different tenor. A real look at class struggle, at class differences, at working conditions, sermons about the necessity of unions, the necessity of living wages, about the need for regulations. The 1800s was an era of many, attempts to tackle social ills. Most prominently, of course, the long struggle that only succeeded with war to eliminate slavery, the long struggle to give women the vote, and many other struggles that we still are facing today. Public education, hospitals, schools for the blind, sailors' aid organizations, trying to find some better or more compassionate way to take care of orphans and so forth. This was very much a feature of religion in the 1800s, particularly in the social gospel context in the Protestant tradition. There is a dimension of Catholicism that is, part and parcel with this approach that endures to this day and has been present for centuries. But when we say the social gospel, and we're talking about folks like Gladden and Rauschenbusch, they were a Baptist and a Congregationalist, respectively. Or did I get that reversed? No, I think I got it right. Matthew.
Just was struck by that apocalyptic idea, the idea that, the reason why Jesus hasn't come is because we haven't got it right yet. And it reminded me, going back to the thing about Pelagius back in the 4th century, that you're born with an inner perfection. There's no such thing as original sin. That's the good news. The bad news is that means you have no excuse. And you have got to get it together and do what God is commanding you to do. And you can't fall back on some excuse about original sin to excuse yourself. You have this, so there's this weight of grim moral purity that has got to be reached, and there's no reason why you are still lazy and not doing everything you can. And that whole tension is also still alive today, right? And maybe we'll get into that next week when we talk about the critiques. I don't know.
Mhm.
But I'm so sensitive to that whole spirit, like grim kind of nature of moral perfectionism that we find among so many on the progressive end of Christian social thinking.
Yes, and beyond.
Yeah.
I can tell you all about it. Hang out with some Unitarian Universalists for a little while if you want grim moral perfectionism. Sorry. It also might be possible to frame that. I know Pelagius gets under your skin a little bit, but we consider ourselves Pelagians somewhat. Unitarian Universalists, at least historically. How about serious moral responsibility? Right? Doesn't necessarily have to be grim, but you do have to take it seriously.
Right. And that's just the whole thing, though, is that where's the line between one and the other? And who, I mean, yeah, it's fraught. I mean, of course, as a liberal, I want to give myself a break all the time. I was like, I'm doing what I can, and, trying to protect myself from ruining my day by judgmental pronouncements against my own sloth and indifference. And of course, that's a part of my own sinful condition, I think, that I'm too willing to give myself a break, perhaps. But, who decides how guilty we should feel?
Why don't you try and answer that question?
Well, I reserve the right to stand up in the pulpit and make everybody feel guilty if it's going to help at all, but it usually doesn't. So I'm as stuck as anybody on this one. This is a tough one.
Right. And I mean, to me, the obvious answer is whether we want it or like it or not, we are each responsible for how guilty we feel or understand ourselves to be in relation to these problems. But the obvious problem with that response is, what if I just say, not guilty at all? Right? If you leave these questions, as philosophically speaking, if you leave the questions of social responsibility or the social expression of Christianity or your own religion or whatever, if you leave that solely to yourself, if you claim that that's an individual decision, then you open the door for the people who choose to ignore it. And then what do you say to the captains of the Gilded Age? At least in 1880, they were likely to still go to church, if only to look good for their neighbors, but also because they'd probably adopted some earlier version of the prosperity gospel and were living in downtown Boston and had plenty of money and weren't hearing things that kept them from that point of view. So, that's why something like the social gospel evolves, is because preachers basically realize, I have a responsibility as a representative of Christ to try and get folks to move this ball forward. Right? Does that ring true or appropriate to others? How much guilt would you like Matthew to apply on Sundays?
Well, one observation for me is it sounds like a preoccupation. Now, I don't mean this to be unfair, but you could say this is sort of a preoccupation with searching for a utopia. There are the goats and there are the sheep. And Jesus said, the poor will always be among you. And so I think we should see the poor and it should move us. But I'm not sure we should be so, I don't know if naive is the word, utopian to think that it's going to disappear ever. That doesn't mean you don't do anything about it, but your mental state of mind, be anxious for nothing, bring everything to the Lord in prayer, think on whatever is beautiful and pure and noble, etc. In Philippians, all these things are things that I think are not meant to hide reality, but to deal with it in a way that we're not paralyzed.
Well said. Dave.
I think you're saying that to do good, you have to be so guilty first. Is that correct? Because if that is what your assumption is, I don't think that's right. I think you can do good, you can help other people without feeling guilt, right?
Yeah.
Yes, ideally, I might argue. And, we could parse what's the difference between feeling guilty and feeling responsible, and how do they motivate you, and is one a stronger demand on our psyche or our soul?
How can you be a light to others if your face is filled with guilt?
Yeah, fair enough. Although if you are directly responsible for wrongdoing and don't demonstrate your awareness of your guilt,
Yeah, definitely.
then can we say that appropriate atonement or restitution is occurring?
Wrongdoing means repentance. You can't live just with wrongdoing. You've got to do something with it.
So we are taught.
One thing, can you hear me?
Yes.
One thing that I wonder is really how far guilt takes most people. I think there are some mentalities where it does, but I think a quality of connection is what tends to move us toward change. If we relate either to another human or an animal in a caring way, when we help them feel better, we feel better. Not because we did a good thing, but because when we connect with people, how they feel affects how we feel.
Mm-hmm.
And whether you call that empathy or something else, but it's the quality of connection, I think, is really important. And what I fear for our culture is that we've so overemphasized individualism. And we don't understand all the amazing rewards of connection with all kinds of being.
Hear, hear.
It seems to be room for, in Israel, they have everybody in the military, and, we've had the Peace Corps, and wouldn't it be wonderful if we had everyone have to do some national service, including, kind of like a conservation corps or working with the homeless, on and on and on, mobilizing the connections that, has been mentioned here.
I long for the day. I have argued for it pretty much my whole life. I really think it would help with many challenges. And the key would be, if it were to succeed, particularly in our horribly divided and dysfunctional land, is you would have to keep the projects so simple, so universal.
Mm-hmm.
Part of the problem with the social gospel as it's manifested in those early days, and then certainly today, is it comes to assume that certain solutions are are the obvious and only answer to the problem, right? Like we have to unionize all workers back in the day. And I think unions did a lot for people, but you know, there are also times when unions don't do a lot for people, and there are other ways to solve problems of working too many hours a day and so on. And so, you know, to not conflate, well, is there a single thing? You know, I've preached many times, like, how about all of humanity just take a 5-year vacation from all arguments? We're not allowed to argue about anything
Yeah.
until no children under 2 go hungry.
Yeah.
Just
A new
that.
jubilee. Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah.
Surely, even the nastiest people in the world don't think 2-year-olds of different groups should starve to death. If they do, well, then we're going to have to get a little more hardcore or something. You know, I don't know what we're going to, but just like take it all the way down. No hungry children. And if you got people from every walk of life and every religion and every state working side by side, schlepping cans of food or bouncing babies on their knees, they would have to sit around and talk to each other and learn about each other, and great good might be accomplished. But I literally can't think of anything other than that that might work.
Yeah. Yeah.
Let's see. Bill asks, how has Protestant atonement theology and salvation by grace alone since the Reformation excused some from doing good works, etc.? Yes. Well, we can say that it has, and certainly the more vocal critiques of the social gospel, even to this day, are arguments more or less from Protestant atonement theology and salvation by grace, that you're not supposed to or don't have to do these works. So that can be a way out. And Matt, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I was just going to bring attention to Bill's question, which is a good one.
Great. Barb.
So in the 70s, I took a workshop from Saul Alinsky, which is really interesting.
All right.
And he shared a lot of shocking examples of nonviolent change. But one of the things that he stuck with me was how he talked about institutions. So like a union, how institutions, like the genesis of an institution might be a radical movement, but over time, as it becomes established, it is more focused on maintaining itself for power. And I experienced that with unions in the East Coast. And I think that we need to shift, and there have been some ideas for shifting, where power is shared and where, you know, everyone is really involved in or has a voice in what happens in an organization. And so that's how you get unions like in West Virginia. When they closed the coal mines in one town, they tore down all the buildings and housing they built for everybody before they left. And, you know, and I'm thinking, and that was a long time ago, like when JFK was running for president. But how those kinds of things are allowed to happen, I don't know. I also think, kind of as a different point of view, when we take our youth to Nicaragua and they go into the villages and they see how people don't have running water, they have dirt floors, and you know, a variety of things. They make at the beginning a lot of comments about how poor these people are. And then they start working alongside of them and they realize that they're really not poor. No, they don't have the material objects that we have, and they do need clean water. They need some changes. But to create change in those villages, for them to be healthy, is a lot smaller order than the change we need in our complex society. to create some things for people. And because they have strong family units, they have, you know, for the most part, religious beliefs, they have schooling that is better. I'm not saying it's great, but it's,
Right. Poverty does not equal unhappiness.
no.
I mean, let's say fewer overall. I mean, poverty is a kind of a tricky word, you know.
Yeah, it
I
is.
mean, if you have your basic needs met, you can live a happy, fulfilled, interesting life. You know, a full human life and have dirt floors. Yeah. I had a similar experience going on a mission trip with my congregational church. We went to Appalachia, somewhere in West Virginia. And I mean, for me, it was just like, wait a minute. Like people with dirt floors and bare feet and one pair of pants in America, I thought we were poor in our little double, you know, with the working class income and a used bicycle. And suddenly I realized I was like, you know, Croesus or Midas or something over here. Bruce.
Chris, we're almost halfway through, and I just want to put something out there for consideration now or later, you know,
Please.
as we go along. And you know, we're calling this the social gospel. And I don't know, I kind of got the term social justice somewhere. And I'm just wondering, you know, in the larger culture, the issue is not so much we hear, you know, the social gospel, it's social justice. And I wonder if we see these connected somehow and how they're different. Just, you know, maybe along the line we could hit on that a bit somehow.
They are, yes, I appreciate the point greatly. They are directly related. Here's a fine little article that I found at a site called The Conversation, which was new to me, sort of interesting quasi-academic, less formal academic setting that did a nice job of just drawing a straight line from the earlier expression as the social gospel to today's social justice warriors. And the response of certain conservative folks against that term, it's also of a piece. You know, on what, if you are of a certain liberal or progressive persuasion, social justice just seems like an obvious good. It means that things are fair, that no one is going without, that people are treated equally. And so this automatically leads to certain understandings of how taxation should work and equal rights for LGBTQ folks and ways of speech and runna. And for a whole other group, much as with the social gospel, social justice equals Marxism. And for some of those progressives, it also does. You know, so these things are like utterly alive.
And that's where I think the key word is justice. What is justice? And we know, you know, there's intuitive justice, which means distributive justice, you know, what people receive. And then part of that also is procedural fairness and transparency and so forth. But does it mean equal outcomes? It is that whole issue of what is justice.
Yeah. Which is a really tricky issue.
And I think it's one of the problems that we as Christians, I'm not sure we're giving enough thought to what we mean by justice in the phrase social justice. And it deserves, you know, not here necessarily, but I'm just suggesting that you know, equal outcomes is a lot different than distributive justice. We know from children, studies with children, they much prefer having unequal fairness as opposed to equal distribution that's not fair.
Say that again, please.
If there's fairness, children say, okay, so I didn't get as much candy as the other guy. I can understand it was fair and there was a reason for it. But if you distribute, everybody gets the same amount, but it's not fair, that's not good. That's the equal outcome problem. You offend people if everything is equal outcome, because you're overlooking the intuitive need for transparency and fairness and all the qualities of fairness that are being ignored.
Right.
So,
I can add to that too, and I see you, Barb. That I mean, I read a lot about justice at one point because that word get invoked in my former circles with the UUs all the time, and it's like, well, what do we really mean? And there's no good definition. They're all circular definitions. Even fair. Well, and equal, do we mean equal outcomes? Do we mean equal distribution? What about the fact that some people are lazy and don't want to do more and other people do? What's fair in that context? And if you're and the very basis of your assumptions, you might think it's fair that, broadly speaking, white people have far greater advantages in American culture than people of color. Because if you think white people are better or God's chosen people or they worked hard to get it or whatever, then it just seems obvious to you. And it might not be at all unfair that other people have less. That's actually, in your mind, fair.
Yeah. That's right. I think the concept of justice, the biblical concept of justice would be non-discrimination. It would mean transparent. It would mean all these qualities that I think we would probably all agree on. Now, then the question of how distribution occurs, that's a different story.
Right. And yes, social Darwinism is one of those byproducts. I have a couple images to show you, but I want to hear from Barb and then Jim, who had their hands up.
One of the ways that I think about this about justice in a very simplistic fashion is that if you have a horse race, you have a bunch of horses in the starting gate, and then you have a bunch of horses that aren't even up to the starting gate, and somebody says, go.
Mm-hmm.
So from the outset, there is not justice because people are not starting from the same place. And so
that's unfair.
Yes, it is unfair. That's why it's
unfair.
Unjust.
And that's the part of justice. It's not only distribution, but it's fairness.
Whatever that means. Barb, were you finished with what you were saying?
Yes. Thank you.
Jim?
I was thinking the term we should be looking at is equality of opportunity, not outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
That's what you want to strive for.
Yeah.
And the other part, I think we're starting to bump up against the term autocracy, which in America is very individualistic. So,
can you see this image? So this gets put in front of us a lot. So, right? I mean, technically equality is everybody gets one box. Or, we all start at the same gate. Now, in a horse race, we all start at the same gate. We're all at the same box. It's just that some horses are faster than other horses and they're going to win. Like that dude who's taller than that poor little fella. So equality, we would often say, is not what we're aiming for. Is this the image you put in the chat, Matt? Okay. So we began to speak more about equity, which in this instance you can see relates to the outcome. The goal is everybody gets to watch a baseball game. And if our tall feller here, he doesn't need a box. He's going to be decent and give his box to the little person on the end. Now, there are other ways of building on this. This one is sadly too small, but maybe you can see it. So we got the equality and the equity, but then someone has said reality is that one portion of people have almost all of the boxes. There's a few in the middle. And look, the little guy on the end, he's not even standing on ground level. They dug a hole to put him in. And then, I don't know, in the real world, I don't know what this would mean, but liberation is like, how about we take that damned fence down and everybody can just watch the game, Matthew?
Yeah, I mean, the issue there is you take the fence away, then the owner of the baseball team is not going to be able to sell any tickets because everybody's going to demand to watch it for free. And by the way, those people are watching that game and they're not buying tickets. There's a problem there, and got to call the cops. So it does get complicated.
Yeah, or they can rush the field and then we're not even playing baseball anymore because there's people milling all over the place. And so the system has completely broken down. We have to have fences.
Bill Graham talking about all the people who thought they had an entitlement to go to their music festivals without having to pay a ticket. And they were like, hey, come on, man, music's for everybody, and
Right.
Yeah, he lost his shirt because he couldn't afford to pay the band.
Well, and the Grateful Dead, of all people, had to write a letter to their fans in 1994 after, several incidences of major bum rushing the show and leaping over fences and security guards getting hit. So our nation's legendary rule breakers were like, hey, don't come if you don't have a ticket. Any other thoughts? So yeah, see, this is what makes it hard, right? What is justice for those homeless people? Is it fair that some people get given houses? Some of the people who would be the strongest against our $50 million program would be the working poor who aren't included, who would say, I'm busting my ass out there every single day, and you're giving houses to these meth addicts? It'll only take you an hour to find someone who will say that to you.
10 minutes.
Michael, and then Dave.
Well, this just arose out of my head in the last second, but if we're really talking about progressive goals, equitable society, and these were achieved through secular offices manned by or staffed by social workers and whatnot, would there need to be an explicit, visible, tangible church? I mean, is it somewhat become redundant or just evaporate into secular progressivism? What's the difference? Or need there be a difference?
That's an excellent question.
Well, answer it.
Well, I am not a pure proponent of the social gospel. I yearn for an empathetic, compassionate society that provides at least the basic level of human need. And I think the hoarding of wealth when so many go without is disgusting, an offense. There's no practical reason that we couldn't have everybody off the streets and everybody fed in the next 10 years if we simply generated the will, and some people were willing to give up 90% of their wealth, which would still leave them richer than all of us put together.
How do you generate the will?
What's that?
How do you generate the will?
How do you generate the will? Yeah.
You need some guy in the pulpit who's going to scold you into doing it.
Well, that is one way. I mean, that is one way, and I believe that much of the good of the world is still accomplished because a person who still thinks of themselves as Christian or of whatever tradition, builds up some big old successful company, and they go to church one day, and the reading is Matthew 25, and they go, oh, hang on, I don't need a second boat. And they make a donation to the local food bank, or they start a nonprofit or whatever. I think that kind of stuff actually happens all the time. I used to, when people would join the UU congregation, we would play this kind of game where you create an imaginary line, and there's a center that equals, and when one side would be yes, I completely agree, or the other side would be no, I completely disagree, or one would be we should rely on reason, and the other side would be we should rely on intuition. And if you were in the middle, that meant equal parts, or I don't know, or something like that. And I would ask them, I would say, broadly speaking, religion has been good for people. Yes or no, right? Without fail. They were all at least on some portion of the no side.
Wow.
Which is why it's very difficult to be a Unitarian Universalist minister. It's like, wait, you're all here at our orientation class and you're about to join the congregation and you think religion is bad for people? Their response would frequently be, well, this isn't religion. See, what it was a social club of people who've all voted Democratic. And so they, in fact, had conflated the two things. And you can't be real and go all the way down to yes, like it's been unbridled benefit. It just takes a crusade or two to burst that bubble. But I said, okay, yes, you're right. There've been some holy wars, although most of the wars, I dare say 90% of the wars in human history, are not religious. They're strictly dynastic. It's for territory, or because those people killed us last year and now we want revenge. It's mostly to get your water or your cows. And religion might go along for the ride. But the number of explicitly holy wars compared to the number of wars is pretty small. Mm-hmm. And then I said, also, okay, add up all of the good deeds, the tiny good deeds, the soup that somebody took to somebody sick because they remember that you're supposed to feed people because of the preaching they hear every day, let alone the number of wars that we can't even know didn't occur because maybe in the 1300s, when getting excommunicated really meant something, maybe the local earl was like, I just want to go kill my brother-in-law because he took my cows last year. And he goes to a sermon where the preacher says, if you continue to engage in frivolous warfare, you're going to go to hell. And he says, I don't want to go to hell. And so they don't have a war. There's no way to measure these negatives, but who knows how much good got done because institutions preached decency.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Dave?
I am unmuted. Yeah. You used the word empathetic, which I've been thinking about ever since half an hour ago when we were talking about guilt can lead to, or maybe should lead to, doing good. I think that people without any religious beliefs can be empathetic, but maybe following a religion does encourage empathy more than a completely secular life. I think that's quite true. And I also, this doesn't seem to be very closely related to the subject, but I keep thinking of happy countries. Denmark was found to be the happiest country. Now, it's not a very religious country, but I think the sense of community is very strong in that country.
Mm-hmm.
But it's relatively easy to have a community of a country of 6 million people or less than it is to have a country of ours. So anyway, I keep thinking, well, if somebody brought up the word obligation, maybe that's better than guilt. And I was kind of worried about myself. I have a pretty easy life, and maybe I should feel a little more obligation to do good. So I'll be thinking about that. I'll report to you about that next.
Good. Then all of this will have been worthwhile, Dave. I'll feel like I've saved another soul. Just to conclude an earlier thought, the other reason why I would never conflate a social agenda with religion per se, or the mere doing of good works, or the pursuit of social justice as the complete expression of faith, which is really the tragic and fatal error that my former tradition, I think, makes, is because there are other things that religion speaks about and points us to that really do transcend all of that. So, awakening, the absorption of the small self into the large self, the felt presence of God as a loving, unifying, whole-making spirit that is above and beyond every nation or idea, which is a real thing you can have. That's something that you won't really hear talked about most other places. Although, I don't know, in America at least, there's a massive industry around spiritual teaching and this kind of thing. And so maybe Deepak Chopra and what's his name, Eckhart Tolle, and these folks are, maybe bookstores and book sales will eventually replace the institution of the church. Something will be lost there. The power of ritual, the power of participating in something that lasts through the centuries, invitation to other states of mind. So, but if it's only that, then it can feel isolated from real life and, a kind of, if it's not too crude, spiritual masturbation. Because it's just like, oh, well, I'm awake enough, good luck to the rest of you.
I'm thinking of, the famous part of scripture in Micah that says, what is it that God desires of us? Walk humbly with the Lord. And I love the word humbly, but then it goes on, and also love mercy, and finally do justice.
Mm-hmm.
And those are three beacons to keep in mind here, I think.
Hear, hear. That's maybe my favorite passage in the whole book. And the Hebrew, I happened to write a paper on this, for what gets translated as love mercy is hesed, which is it's a broader word than mere mercy. Like a king might be merciful to some subject or something like that. It actually means, it's closer to like the necessary frame of mind to keep the group intact. It's like love your communal glue. And if there's one thing that communities need in order to glue themselves together, it's kindness and mercy and forgiveness.
Yes. Which we don't find on social media.
think
Barb,
what
are you raising your hand or just adjusting your glasses? Just adjusting your glasses. Okay. Hey, my gosh, we're rolling along here. So I just want to toss a couple of other things in your direction. Um, I'm going to put in the chat, since I'm not sure I'm even going to get there, a couple of articles that I found where some contemporary people critique the social gospel and or social justice. And these are from more evangelical or kind of fundamentalist points of view, but it'll just give sort of that's for your own reading later on. And you've heard my critique of it as well, that it is at best a partial expression.
Could Matthew send these to us also?
I'm sure he'll do that. Thank you.
Great, great.
Now, lastly, then, another component for me that is present here that we haven't talked much about is the very notion of progress and the improvability of the world. I think it was, Bruce, you suggested that it's possible, that it is possible that the world doesn't or can't get better. That Jesus was fully prescient when he said, "The poor will always be with you." It certainly seems to be true in regards to your point about institutions, Barb, is that arc of movements turning into institutions and then ossifying and ceasing to be useful is about as dependable as the life cycle of a human being or the sun, coming up in the morning. And it's not all bad. Personally, I think, you have to have it, given how power works and that some people really do have power. If you do get any, it's very worthwhile hanging on to it. Because there's a lot of powerlessness in the world, and that's worse. I'd rather have a big clunky institution than have no power or no allies or friends or place to meet at all. But will those, do they fall apart? Do they lose their way? Yes, meet the new boss, same as the old boss, as the prophet Pete Townsend taught us. And so, but the social gospel proponents, and certainly it seems, many proponents of social justice kind of see the march of history as upward. And this, where is history going, is a fun old word, teleology, right? What's the point of it all? Where's it going? In the kind of classic Christian model, I guess, for some mysterious reason, God makes a world, it falls apart, and then the story of history is some long thing that includes Jesus that will ultimately result in some kind of restoration, the final separation of the good from the bad, and then those who remain live happily ever after. Judgment Day is where history is going. And other people, from a more Eastern perspective, see it as entirely cyclical. It never gets any better or any worse. It just is what it is. And one thing that I think marked the social gospel, in addition to that, those stirrings of conscience and the excesses of the Gilded Age, was a remarkable optimism. That age, at least for elite folks who could even think about these things, they just thought it was going to keep getting better and better. Like, wow, look, we figured out fossil fuels and we figured out machines, and now we're figuring out genetics. Some of the social gospel folks of like the 20s, I think of someone in our tradition named Clarence Skinner, who wrote a lovely book called The Social Implications of Universalism, which would be a major text of the social gospel if anybody other than Universalists had ever read it. He thought it was just boop, boop, boop. And one way we were going to get there was we would use eugenics to breed out all of the bad things.
Mhm.
That idea got twisted, some 20 years after that to horrid effect, and very few people, will argue for that any longer. And this really is a question, do things get better? How fast do they get better? Can they get better? One of the most striking expressions of this optimism comes from a fella in the Unitarian tradition named James Freeman Clark with an E. And you can find many of his writings online. He was the preeminent Unitarian preacher of the mid-late 1800s. Wrote books that went 33 printings and had a huge congregation in Boston and so forth. And at one point he wrote a text called The 5 Points of Calvinism and the 5 Points of the New Theology. And he contrasted his liberal religious perspective with the earlier Calvinist one in a system of 5 and 5. Calvin's 5 points were like, absolute depravity, atonement by Christ for the elect only, etc., etc. And Freeman Clark had 5, some which will be familiar from our earlier conversations. The fatherhood of God, the language in his text in particular is so man, brother, father oriented, it's almost embarrassing. So let's say the parenthood of God. Second point, the siblinghood of humanity. I'll correct his errors. Third, the leadership of Jesus by example, which we've also talked about, a Christology that saw him more as an exemplar and teacher. And then another point that maybe Channing got us toward, which was we call salvation by character. That salvation doesn't mean like this one thing that happens and then we're off and we enjoy some state of eternal bliss, but salvation is an ongoing process of the betterment of a person in this world, whatever betterment means. And then number 5, the 5th point of doctrine in the new theology, I'm quoting now, will, I believe, be the continuity of human development in all worlds. Or, another way of putting it, the progress of humankind onward and upward forever. Right? That here or there wouldn't be an ending point. And I am going to just read a little bit of this for you because it's a kind of a remarkable statement. Here, maybe I'll share my screen just so that you can follow along a little bit. 5 points, share. Okay. He says, progress is the outward heaven corresponding to the inward heaven of character. So people are growing on the inside and becoming, adding to the goodness of the world through their own growth in goodness, and then that will express itself socially through progress. The hope of progress is one of the chief motives to action. People are contented no matter how poor their lot, so long as they can hope for something better. And people are discontented no matter how fortunate their condition when they have nothing more to look forward to. The greatest sufferer who hopes may have nothing, but possesses all things. The most prosperous who is deprived of hope may have all things, though possessing nothing. The old theology laid no stress on progress, here or hereafter. The essential thing was conversion. That moment passed, the object of life was attained. A person converted on the deathbed after a life of sin was as well prepared for heaven as someone who had led a Christian life during long years. And there was no hint given of further progress after heaven should be reached. Eternity was to be passed in perpetual thanksgiving or in perpetual enjoyment of the joys of paradise. Such, however, was not the teaching of Jesus, he goes on to claim. The servant who earned 2 pounds was made ruler over 2 cities. He who earned 5 pounds had care of 5. So I guess you could always do better, right? And the Apostle Paul tells us that one of the things which abide is hope. And if hope abides, there is always something to look forward to, some higher attainment, some larger usefulness, some nearer communion with God. All this accords with what we see and know, with the long process of geologic development by which the earth became fitted to the home of humanity, with the slow ascent of organized beings from humbler to fuller life. He's read his Darwin. With the progress of society from age to age, with the gradual diffusion of knowledge, advancement of civilization, growth of free institutions, and ever higher conceptions of God and of religious truth. The one fact which is written on nature and human life is the fact of progress, and this must be accepted as the purpose of the Creator. It goes on from there. What do you think about that, Matt? You're shaking your head. Are you don't believe in progress, you poor, sour, bitter?
This is the what I think is a fairly dangerous ideology that got pretty much shattered with World War I and the best of Europe and America slaughtered in the trenches, and then World War II and the Holocaust, not to mention the Great Depression and Vietnam and Cambodia and China and Russia, mass murder everywhere you look. And, right now, what we're looking at is the potential loss of everything that we've ever held sacred in terms of civilization and democracy and progress. And to believe that progress is inevitable is to fail to take seriously the precipice upon which we are leaning. We're leaning into the void, and we can whistle our way past the graveyard all we want, but there will be no rescue unless we get our act together. And that's not going to happen on its own. And God is going to, just as the Roman Empire collapsed and there were hundreds of years of illiteracy, horrible poverty, and desperate straits, there's no reason to think that won't happen again. So I have a very hard time with that whole idea. But it is also true, and this is where he's confused, I think, it does motivate people to preach progress. And does people no good at all to just tell them they're doomed.
Right.
Why even the most hardcore scientists of climate science are saying, well, there's still hope, because what's the alternative? You're going to just depress everybody and everybody's just going to, go to their living rooms and take cyanide. I mean, you got to have some hope. You can't.
Right.
So just because it's motivating to preach progress doesn't mean progress is going to happen. And there's a real confusion there.
and I think he's right, actually. I just don't think it's inevitable.
Right.
I really do think, in spite of those major setbacks, if you compare this century to 500 years ago, broadly speaking, for most people, it's way better. And so, but could it all fall apart? Absolutely. The nice person who's next to Dave, I'm not sure I know your name, and I think I saw Barb's hand too.
My name is Joan.
Hi, Joan.
Hi. Matthew, I'm interested in what you were talking about, imminent doom and gloom if we don't take care of ourselves these days. It made me think, have you ever have you ever read Steven Pinker's The Better Angels of Our Nature? He is pretty articulate in thinking that we have made great progress over the centuries and seem to think that it was going to continue inevitably. Have you read that?
No, I'm familiar with the argument, and I mean, it's true. I think he's right that there is less violence and less war now than there was ever before. But that is not a prediction of the future. It's like what they say with your portfolio. You know,
Yeah, past
results of the
performance.
past don't guarantee results in the future.
Yeah.
No, I don't want to get depressing here, but I just think it's a dangerous thing to assume things are going to get better.
Right. Perhaps it's enough to be able to say things can get better.
They can get better. Yes.
Mhm.
Not
But we
that
have
they
to
will.
work at it.
Right.
I
Barb?
think I'm hearing you say we have to work at it.
There's two Barbs. Barb Foster, did you want to speak? Okay. So I got distracted. Let me just get my head going back.
Yeah. Yeah. We were talking
Right.
progress. Matt mentioned doom and gloom.
Right. Okay. I have been delving into a book that it's called Belonging Through Belonging Through a Culture of Dignity. And the two writers, one is Black, one is white. They've done a lot of research around belonging. It's not a religious book, but boy, the concepts they're talking about just sing to me in terms of the connection to the profound messages I hear in Christianity. And one of the things they talk about, is the whole idea of their book focuses on the idea that when people really need to belong. One of the main concepts in the world is belonging. And I think it's linked to so many comments other people have made today, like Elizabeth's comment about conversation and sharing and connection, but that it isn't enough to talk about diversity and negative thinking, or even using a term like anti-racism versus becoming the beloved community will
Right.
not be sustained over time. If people get lost in that negative, and the negativity diffuses that. And so they do talk about hope being so important. And this is maybe an odd example, but one of the most profound movies that I saw was about children being raised to win beauty pageants. It was a hard documentary to watch, but it was also really a great one from my perspective, because this family used only negative, guilt, negativity put down to this little girl who wanted to be a beauty queen. And somebody finally convinced them they needed to get a different coach, and the family needed to get out of the way. And you watch the way this coach kind of gushed over this little girl. He made her feel so wonderful. He just really shaped every cell in her body to feel great about herself. And she wound up having hope and started winning. Now, I'm not advocating for little girls to be in beauty pageants.
That's the takeaway.
but I mean, it was really that idea of being positive and not trying to pigeonhole her, or stratify. And we do all those things.
Can you say the name of the book again?
The book that I have been going through is Belonging Through a Culture of Dignity. It focuses on equity in education, but if some people will read it and get bogged down in the education examples. So what I've been doing is pulling out the ideas for application, to other institutions.
Cool. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yes, Harriet notes, in the classic story of Pandora, all that she can save in the box was hope. Now, see, you have opened a can of worms, or Pandora's box, I guess, technically. I'll just leave the question. The way that story got told to me is it was like all of the ills of the world.
Mm-hmm.
But the one that she could close and keep was hope. What is hope doing in a box of the ills of the world? That's the one ill we kept, not our one blessing. The Tao Te Ching has a few things to say about that, but I'll just have to leave it there for now. I'm glad to have hope. I certainly do. I hope, ding, that you do. And we've reached the end of our time, so sadly we're going to have to wrap things up. There's just one last resource I want to give you, and Matt will, I imagine, send this out as well. There's a website called archive.org that I've put into the website, or into the chat there, excuse me. And should you ever visit it, I'm going to share my screen. This is just kind of an all-purpose, I'm doing my good deed for the day by turning you on to archive.org. Archive.org is the website of the Internet Archive, which is an electronic library that tries to capture every website that ever gets published, as well as a zillion other things, including lectures, live music, and old books of every kind of variety. They're a major foundation with funding, and almost all of the people that we've ever talked about in class here, all of these old timers, you can find, as you can see, scanned copies of their original books. This happens to be A Common Faith by John Dewey. You might want to read it. It's an all-time classic, but to find it, you're going to have to pay money, and certainly to find it in its original form, you're going to pay a whole ton of money. But here it is for free on archive.org. And you can make this reader more useful. You could use it on your iPad or whatnot. So if you're interested in getting into the old stuff, which can be so hard to find if you don't have access to a theological library, I urge you to spend some time swimming around on archive.org. The Live Music Archive is just a resource of inestimable value to me, not least because the entire live recorded output of the Grateful Dead exists there. Soundboards of almost every show. Now I've done my good deed for the day and for my guru. So there you have it. Anyway, check out archive.org. If you're library minded, it'll blow your mind. Okay.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, everybody, for a beautiful class. What a great delight to have you all here.
Thank
See you again next week, same time for our last class.